This is the first piece of furniture I ever built. It's a coffee table that I made 8 years ago. I made it out of pine, filled the screw holes with wood putty, and stained it way too dark. It's taken a lot of abuse over the years, but honestly, most of the issues you're seeing were here from day one. My family still loves the table, but I can't stand looking at it anymore. So I'm taking everything I've learned and the tools I've accumulated over the past 8 years, and I'm going to try to make a new coffee table that I can be proud of. Now there's a lot I don't like about this old table, but there's a few things that I really do, and I want to try to take that all into account when building the new one. First, it's too big for the space that it's in, and I really don't like its shape. A circle or oval will work way better here. I also want the new table to be lighter in color and more durable. As far as the pros for the old table go, there's not much, but I do love how much storage it has, so we'll try to incorporate that into the new design as well. With the basics figured out, we can get started, and the first issue to deal with was the wood species and color. Pine is cheap and easy to work with, which made it perfect for a first project, but it's a softwood, and it takes dings and scratches really easily. And that's one of the reasons that this table looks so bad 8 years later. This time around, I'm going with white oak. It's a hardwood, meaning it won't damage easily, and it also has beautiful color and grain, and it should really lighten up our living room. I bought all this oak rough sawn, which means I need to mill it all flat before I can start building. Milling your own lumber is a great option because it allows you to use any type of wood you want for your project. But it does mean you'll need a planer and a jointer. In my last video, I went over the entire process of milling and how much it cost me to get started. Check that video out if you're interested, but spoiler alert, milling is expensive and really time consuming. I enjoy the process and the freedom that it gives me, but it just wasn't an option when I built my first project. So if you're not ready to start milling, no worries. That's exactly what big box stores and lumber yards are for. Laying out my boards to find the order that they look best in was a really fun part of this build. I went with riffs on oak, which means the grain on each board runs straight and uniformly. And this makes glue lines look almost invisible, which is exactly the look I'm going for here. But I did want to introduce a little character here, so on each side of the panel, I added a board that had a little more life to it. These could definitely be considered defects, but I think they're really beautiful. I decided to go with a 36-inch circular table and made a template to mark out how it would look when it was cut to size. I also numbered all my boards so I wouldn't forget their order. Then I used the in-out method to give them one final pass on the joiner and get them ready for glue up. I didn't even glue up the top of the original coffee table. To be honest, it never even crossed my mind when building it, or for about a year after it was done. It wasn't until a glass of chocolate milk or juice or some other terrible sticky drink spilled, ran down through the cracks in the table, and all over the board games and toys underneath, that I thought, hey, that wouldn't have happened if this top was glued together. This glue up went pretty smooth, but I don't have a domino joiner and I didn't use any dowels, so I needed to throw a few extra clamps on my boards to keep them aligned. Once the glue had dried, I gave both sides a rough sanding and started to plane away my milling and glue up sins. As you can see by the wobbly level, this panel had quite the bow in it. This isn't a huge deal, and the possibility of this is exactly why I milled my boards to just over 1.5 inches. I've got room to work with here, and everything turned out nice and flat in the end, but I'm not going to lie to you, this part sucked and it took hours to fix. With things finally flattened out, it was time to cut this panel into a circle. I grabbed my circle cutting jig, my router, and a 1/4 inch cutting bit, and started making passes a 1/4 inch deep at a time. Once I was about an inch into the board, I removed the circle cutting jig and used a jigsaw to follow my router's line and cut the excess wood off. I also made sure not to cut too close to the inside of my line. My jigsaw was having a hard time cutting around some of the wilder grain on one side of my panel, and it was causing some chip out. No big deal though, I grabbed a handsaw and finished off the cut. I switched over to a templating bit in my router and cleaned up the majority of the excess wood, but I flipped the table and used a flush trim bit for the last pass. Now that the top of the coffee table is cut to rough shape, I can move on to the base. And things start here pretty much the same as they did with the top. I mill my boards flat into size, then cut my boards to length and get them laid out in an order I'm happy with. I'm using the in and out method again here, and if you're unfamiliar with it, let me give you a quick overview. If you are familiar with it, just think about birds or something while you wait, I guess. On the inside edge of the first board in your panel, write the word in. Then on the edge of the board directly touching it, write the word out. Continue this pattern on all your boards. Next, bring your boards back to your joiner and make 2 passes on each board. The first pass with the word in facing down and towards your joiner's fence. Next, make a pass with the word out facing down and out towards the open side of your joiner. Do this to all your boards and it will negate any issues caused by your joiner's fence not being perfectly square to the in and out feed tables. Okay, we're back, and you can stop thinking about birds or whatever, you nerd. I glue up my panels, and once they're dry, I can get them cleaned up. The edge of these panels needs to be cut square, and there's plenty good ways to make this cut, but I'm going to be using a jig I made that turns a circular saw into a track saw. This jig makes cuts like this way easier and more accurate than trying to cut them by hand. Not only did I not have this fancy little jig when I made the first coffee table, but I didn't even have a circular saw. I had a cordless drill and a sander, and that was it. We had a miter saw at my work, but that meant making a cut list every night, taking it with me to work, making my cuts, and bringing them home with me the next night. If something didn't fit, which happened pretty often, I would have to wait until the next day and try it all over again. I remember on a Friday night trying to put the top together to that table, and one of my boards being a 1/4 inch too long, and I just couldn't wait until Monday to fix it. So I made the decision to furiously sand it until it matched the rest, giving me this wonky line down the whole edge. A circular saw on this jig would have made that job so much easier. Once I have a square edge, I can take my panels to the table saw and cut them to length and to width. I've got to get these 3 legs glued together to make my base, but before I can, each leg needs 2 30-degree cuts made so that they can fit together like they should. I set my saw's blade to 30 degrees and make my first cut. This cut went fine, but I forgot to raise my saw's blade to account for the angle, and it didn't cut through the entire board on the first pass. I flipped the board and made my second pass, which removed all the waste material I missed on the first one. Not a huge issue, but I did make sure to raise the blade for my next cuts, because I'm going to need those offcuts later in the build. I have a few knot holes and voids in my panels, and I used black epoxy to fill them up. I think it's a clean look, and one I've been really happy with every time I've used it. Once the epoxy had cured in the larger voids, I can fill the smaller cracks with a mixture of wood glue and sawdust. The top of my table was looking a little boxy, so I decided to put a thumbnail profile on its edge. And before adding an edge profile, I like to sand everything up to 100 grit. If you're worried about not sanding your piece evenly, try lightly scribbling on it with a pencil, start sanding, and once all your marks are gone, you should be ready to change grits. I used a 5/8 inch roundover bed on this 1.5 inch tabletop. And to get a thumbnail profile instead of a traditional roundover, just raise your bit slightly higher than your router's base plate. This gives you a rounded profile, but will still leave a clean line where the top meets the edge. And that combo really works for me. Unfortunately, adding this profile did cause an issue. I had some pretty serious tear out here, and it's big enough that I can't just fill it with sawdust and glue and call it good. The only way I can see to fix it is to add a new piece of wood as a patch. But I can't do that until I get a flat and square gap to put it in. I'm using a 1/2 inch chisel to cut the patch, and I don't have a ton of experience with the chisel, but I took it slow and removed as little as possible each pass so that I didn't make the problem worse. And eventually, I got a rectangular hole that I could work with. I found a scrap piece of oak that was a decent grain match and milled it down to the exact width of the hole I cut. Then added glue and clamped it in place. Once the patch dried, I used a pull saw to cut it to length and a hand plane to bring it down to just above the top of the table. Some people may have taken the patch all the way down flush to the table using the hand plane, but I didn't trust my skills with it, so instead I finished it off with a sander. The patch fit in pretty nicely, and there wasn't much of a gap left over, but it wasn't quite perfect, and to make up for that, I used a mixture of wood glue and sawdust to fill in the small cracks, then sanded it again. And I think it came out pretty good. But what do you think? Can you spot the patch? Now it's time to glue up the base, and if possible, I like to line the edges next to my glue lines with painter's tape. It catches most of the squeeze out and cuts down on the amount of cleanup to do later. This is kind of an awkward glue up, but it was made way easier by having the off-cut pieces we saved earlier. The angles on these cutoffs are naturally complementary to the angles on the legs, which makes them perfect clamping blocks. Between these and a large ratchet strap, I won't say this was an easy glue up, but it was definitely doable. Now, as you may have noticed, I mentioned that one of the only things I still like about the old coffee table is that it has storage underneath. This one was also supposed to have storage, but as you can see, that's not the case. I don't have a great excuse here, I just couldn't come up with a design that met all my wants and also had storage. The best I can say is that the space between each leg makes a great place to sit and use the table. So, even though it doesn't store things, it's a great place to store people. Now that the base is together, I have to find out a way to attach it. And the first step was to get it centered on the top. You can do this by measuring the distance from each leg to the edge of your top, but I think I found an easier way. I already had a hole dead center in the bottom of the tabletop. I also know the exact center of my base, so I drilled a hole in the base to match the one in the top, then added a dowel, and now I can easily place and swivel the base as much as I need. Now, if that tip doesn't deserve a like and a subscribe, then I've got bad news for you, because that's kind of the best we've got over here at One Way to Make. But if you are enjoying the video, pushing those little buttons really does help, and I appreciate it. And if you want to help out even more, check out our Patreon. The goal is to be able to have more interaction there than a video like this can offer. With Q&As and one-on-one communication, we hope to grow into a fun community together. And by joining, you'll also have a chance to snag up some sweet merch like this, the shirt of internet motivation, with great real comments such as, "That voice is really annoying, like seriously," and "Absolute garbage." And my personal favorite, "He's got baby hands." With reviews like that, who wouldn't want to be a part of this community? So, if you're interested, follow the link in the description, and if not, no sweat. And thanks for sticking with the video this far. Unfortunately, I can't just screw the base directly into the top. Due to the change in humidity, the wood top of this coffee table will expand and contrast with the seasons. It's not enough to notice by looking at it, but it's enough to rip out any fasteners we put in it and even cause the wood to crack over time. There's nothing we can do to stop this movement. We just need to allow it to do its thing and still be attached somehow. To do this, we're going to add threaded inserts and metal plates. Let's start with the metal plates. I cut 3 pieces of this 1/8-inch thick steel into 6-inch sections. Each plate gets 3 holes drilled in it, 1 oversized for a bolt, and 2 with a chamfer for screws. Perfect. I don't want these plates to stick out below the table, so I'm going to recess them into my table by routing a relief. And since I need to make 3 of these, I put together this jig to make the job more easily repeatable. I route away most of the material freehand. Then, using a template and a templating bit, I clean up the recesses. The router left these rounded corners, which could easily be made square with a chisel, but I like the soft corners, so instead, I grind down the sharp corners of each plate. Once my plates are fitting properly, I can install them first onto the base, and then set them into the recess and mark for our threaded inserts. I was definitely not using threaded inserts when I built the first coffee table, and in fact, this was my first time using them, and honestly, it was a breeze. I drilled a slightly oversized hole, then chamfered the top, and slowly worked the threaded inserts inside. Because the bolt hole in my metal plate is larger than the bolt itself, the tabletop now has room to move as the seasons change. The table's just about done. All that's left to do is a whole lot of sanding and applying some finish. But this can be tricky. A beautiful project can really suffer from a lackluster finish. And out of the many things I don't like about the original table, it's the light wood poking out of the dark stain that tops that list. For this project, I wanted a finish that would be durable and keep the natural look of the oak. For that, I went with Rubio Monocoat, which was also a first for me. And although I'm not much of a stain person anymore, I did go with a tinted option instead of the Pure. Pure has no color added, but since Rubio was oil-based, it can darken the wood a bit. I went with Natural, which is designed to keep the natural color of a light wood, and I think it worked pretty well, and I'm happy with the results. But in the future, I'll probably keep things simple and use Pure for all my projects. I added N3 Nano Finish after the Rubio had cured, and there's definitely some room for improvement as far as application goes, but the products themselves were awesome. A lot can change in 8 years, and I've built a lot of stuff since then. Bedside stands, credenzas, cabinets, sliding doors. I turned a basement into a living space, built a patio and a garage, well, half a garage, also half of a half bath, still no side stairs though. I've also loved a lot, but lost some too. There's been some high highs and some really low lows. My style's clearly changed a lot, and now I can look back on something I made and truly be embarrassed by it, but also be proud of it. I don't know what the next 8 years will bring, but if I can look back on this table the same way as I do the first, I think I'll be pretty happy. And if you've ever even considered trying woodworking, or anything else that you're too scared to try, don't wait. Get out there and make something ugly. You don't know where it will lead, but I promise you won't regret it. Thanks so much for watching.